When you have pure intentions, you don't have to battle so much with like insecurity, because you know at the end of the day, even if you made a mistake, even if you didn't do what you set out to do, you know from the beginnings you built it on solid intentions.
In this podcast, you'll hear stories about how people entered tech, how they found community and built rituals to instill values that gave them the confidence to thrive in tech. Glad to have you here. Boom. All right. Hi, welcome to Hello World Podcast. Here we have James joining us, and we're just going to hear from him about his experience on how he entered tech and what he does to thrive in tech. James, thanks for coming. Appreciate you.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, my name is James. I work at Riot Games with Seth. That's how we met. I don't like to label myself, but if I had to pick a label, I'd say creator. That's what I do. I create, and pretty much anything I do, that's like what drives me. I work in games, always wanted to work in games, always have, like, you know, as a hobby.
When was the first moment that you felt like, hey, I am inspired by just games, entertainment? Like, when did you know you wanted to be a creative? Because I feel like you do a lot of things. You know, you're not just working in games. You wear a lot of hats. So tell us about the different hats you wear, and tell us about when you're like, okay, this is going to be something I was going to pursue.
Mm-hmm. I think it kind of all started for me as a kid, just like getting my first Game Boy for Christmas and like getting Pokemon and playing that and acknowledging how that game made me feel. It was the first time I enjoyed anything so much that I'd go to sleep doing it and wake up doing it. And like, that's how hard I played Pokemon. And I think that was kind of like what opened my mind to like what entertainment can do for someone, like how it can kind of challenge your brain. And I'm not just talking games when I say entertainment, obviously, like just anything I watch or do or play, I'm like thinking through it like a creator. Now, I think that was the first experience that kind of opened my mind. I think the first thing that made me decide I wanted to be a creator was when I played like Final Fantasy VII.
Oh,
by Square Enix, yeah. I remember my uncle had got the game and he would play it, and like I didn't understand it. I was still too young, like 8 or 9 years old maybe, and I didn't understand the game or RPGs or how it played, but my uncle would make it really funny and like animated for me, and he'd like just joke around. He'd call Cloud like Cheese Puff Head, and like he'd like puppet, like just like, I don't know, like just say things like treat him like a puppet and just do funny things. And then one day, like just because I was so entertained by how my uncle like presented the game, I just wanted to play it. And when I played it and got into like the dialogue and the story and the characters, and I was like, wow, and it just like left such a huge impression on me. And I was like, I want to make people feel like this. You know what I mean? Like the roller coaster of emotions, from like the ups, the downs, and just how it made me feel. So that's what made me decide I wanted to create like stories and experiences for people.
Awesome. What do you think like was so different about that experience versus the other things that you had played? Like, what was the element that you're like, wow, I didn't know entertainment could do this?
I think it's what the characters made me feel. It was like, just like, I don't know, just identifying with their struggles and just like the emotions that the game made me feel, I think was the most powerful thing. And that's why I love RPG games to this day. You know, I feel like it's kind of a drought right now. You know, there's a drought on like really like story-driven games, like how they were. Like the 90s RPG games just hit different.
That was classic. That was a good time.
I think it was just like the way I cared for the characters, and it had me at the edge of my seat to find out what happens next, right? And then, you know, when certain twists in the game happen, like when it affects me to the point that it brought me to tears, it's like, you know, it's like, wow. It's like, and it's just before that, I didn't see video games that way. I saw them as just like something fun to do, like for kids to play. But when I played that game and those themes and the way it made me feel, it's just like, whoa, this is bigger than just entertainment.
I think Final Fantasy VII fans all know what you mean when you say brought to tears. No spoilers, no spoilers, but great game. Please check that out. But yeah, I definitely remember that. I remember seeing the commercial to that game, and just like seeing like at that time the graphics was like, yo, this is a game. And then like, you know, when I got to certain moments in that game, I too was like so moved, and I was so like shaken up, and also so angry at like the, you know, the villains, the antagonists that cause those events. And that for me too was like a pretty big moment to where I was like, oh, I definitely want to tell a story that makes people feel that way. So like, you know, I think a lot of times in our journey as creatives, we come across something someone else created. It's a cycle. And then we get inspired, and then we can't stop talking about that. It may even annoy some of our friends, but we're super passionate about this. And then there's this like, okay, I'm really passionate about this. I like this. I want to contribute to the community the same way a creator contributed to me. What was that like for you, making that leap from, oh, I'm passionate about this, I like playing this, but now I want to create?
I didn't even finish Final Fantasy VII when I first played it. Like, I was a little kid. It was too hard for me, certain parts. Like, and that was my struggle with like RPG games when I was younger, and even games like Metal Gear Solid. It's just like I played it, but I could never beat it because it was too hard. But what it made me do was like start writing stories, just like making up my own characters. And like at first it emulated a lot of what I saw in like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII. But that was kind of like the start for me. But you know, when you're a kid, things come and go. There's so much going on. I kind of put it down for a little bit. And that was when I was 9. I stopped thinking about it for a bit until I was like, I want to say 13 years old. And I discovered like online games like RuneScape and
Classic.
And MapleStory.
Classic.
And these are games that really made me make up my mind that I want to make games, right? And MMO games specifically. Like my dream, one of my biggest dreams is to create like a genre-defining MMO. Like it's a mission for me. I have to do it, right? But when I was 13, I started playing online games, and then I started messing around with like private servers, because like these games, like you either had to pay to play them like monthly, or they were like, that was the beginning of like pay to win. And just paying for video games was out of the question for me and like my family, right? I couldn't convince my mom, my grandmother, anyone to really do that. So I got into private servers, but that was the best thing I could have done, because then I got into like making private servers and like joining private server development teams, and really you're hosting like your own version of a live service game at that point. And you're learning a lot about server client connections and stuff like that. I don't know if that's the best way to get into it these days, but back then it was the best way I could have got into game development. And I went from hosting and building private servers of games to trying to make my own online games. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I took that knowledge I gained from like server client relationships and databases and all that stuff, and then I started trying to build my own. But MMO games are impossibly ambitious, and it's almost impossible for anyone to build one alone, let alone a 13-year-old, 14, 15-year-old kid, right? So I started testing, which is what I do now at Riot. I'm a QA engineer, quality assurance. So I started getting on MMO teams as like a tester. It's like, how can I get on an MMO team with like no experience, right? Well, a tester, you don't really need to have much experience other than playing a bunch of games, which I did. I played like every MMO, like every free-to-play MMO I could get my hands on. So I had a good wealth of experience by the age of 15, 16 on MMOs, and I got on the development team as a tester, and that's kind of how I started learning game development, like formally, like from people that are way older than me, way more experienced than me, asking a lot of questions and stuff like that. I did that like 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 different teams. None of the games ever got off the ground or took off, but it was the learning, the experiences there that really reinforced like what I want to do and led me on the right path.
So I want to touch on none of the games really took off the ground. You know, you obviously had this passion here. How did you navigate like wanting to see something realized, pouring time into it, but then it not being realized? Like, what advice do you have for anyone that's going through that? Maybe they're trying to like, you know, start learning how to code, or they're joining these game teams, but then like at the last minute, the group always splits up, or they're trying to like, you know, film something, etc. How do you navigate being passionate about something, wanting to realize it, and then still keep trying and trying and trying?
Yeah, I have a 2-part answer to this. I'll say how I navigated it then and how I navigate it now. So then, I was just so hype on the idea of making games and being a game developer that I almost didn't care whether it shipped or completed or not. I didn't know what it felt like to ship a game, to complete a game anyway. So there was like no feeling that I felt like I was missing out on by doing that. It was really the journey for me, like just doing it, you know, every day, like the new challenge, learning new things and stuff like that. Eventually, my problem, especially back then, is like a 15, 16-year-old, I didn't have enough self-discipline to like follow through on things. So like I'd be really hype at first and help make the game, and eventually just like I get interest in something else. And it's like I'm chasing something else now. I get less active on the team, end up leaving the team to do something else. And it's just like, you know, I had no self-discipline. But that kind of ties into how I deal with this now. Because to this day, I've never really saw a project through from beginning to end, and I've started probably dozens at this point. How I look at it now, and it took me a long time to learn this, you got to go in it for like increasing your skills, like bettering yourself. That has to be your goal, because if that's your goal, you never fail.
Wow.
Every challenge you take on is just making you better, making you better. So eventually when you do finish a project, it's going to be way better than any of those projects you could have finished before, right? I have a couple of projects I'm entertaining right now. I'll say entertaining because I don't like adding pressure, like, oh, I'm working on this, because working on this implies that you need to finish it. Forget the pressure of finishing it. Just think, I want to be a programmer. Okay, I want to be a games programmer. Start making a game to learn programming. It doesn't matter if the game succeeds or releases or anything. It matters what you learn. And that's what I'm doing now. I want to learn 3D modeling, drawing, systems design that you're helping me out with. You know, all these things I want to learn, and I'm so excited to learn these, and I'm so committed. I'm building projects to help me learn these things, and I'm not as committed to the projects as I am to like learning and getting better.
That's a really, really, really great perspective, because I think a lot of times when people focus on did I complete something, and if they don't, they get crippled with the failure, and then they lose the confidence of, hey, can I move forward? Because I said I was working on this, you know, that word working on this, and then it didn't work. And now it's like, oh, you know, maybe it's not even coming from you. Maybe it's coming from like voices externally saying like, oh, you keep saying you're doing stuff and you're not doing it. Look at you. But what you're doing is you're saying like, hey, the project that I'm always working on is me.
Exactly.
It's always my skills. I'm always like leveling up.
Yep.
How did you learn that perspective? That's like a very, very, you know, I think it's a very resilient point of view. It gives you a lot of like resilience. Like, how did you come across that?
Really, it's like being my own therapist. You know, I went through the crippling like feeling of failure multiple times when I didn't finish a project, when I would announce a project to my friends and family, hey, I'm working on this, and they're all, you know, at first I got addicted to that high of like everybody believes in you and they're behind you and they're supporting you. But when that high goes away and you're left with this project that you committed to, you know, it's a lot of pressure, right? I think what I had to do, a lot of it was like asking myself like the tough questions. Like, hey, why did you start this project? Was it for that high you get of like family and friends supporting you, or was it because you wanted to finish it, or was it because you were building your skill? And in the beginning, the answers were the wrong answers. It was like, oh, because of, you know, the clout of like this or the support I got, you know? And that didn't feel great, but acknowledging that was what helped me like better myself and do things for better reasons and do things for the right reasons, right? I think the best thing you can do is have good intentions. Because when you have pure intentions, you don't have to battle so much with like insecurity. Because you know at the end of the day, even if you made a mistake, even if you didn't do what you set out to do, you know from the beginnings you built it on solid intentions. So you can always lean back on that, like, you know, I'm not a failure because my intent is to get better, and through every failure I learn. You know what I mean? Just build everything on like solid intentions. And really ask yourself the tough questions of what are your intentions? If my intentions are just to show off or to this or that, then don't go through with that. But if your intentions are to be a better person, to build something that the world will enjoy, to build something that you will enjoy, then just, you know, go all in on that.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think like it can be kind of tough to be honest with yourself and figure out what, what are my real intentions here. Um, I guess like, do you have any advice for somebody who is like peeling back the layers of their intentions? And and how do you start having that dialogue with yourself? For example, you may say like, "Oh, I want to make this genre of game because like there hasn't been an entry in this genre in a long time and it'll be great." But maybe like you just are doing that to distract you from some other personal issue and you're just taking on another project. So how do you know when your intentions are right, at least for you? Like, how do you know your intentions are right? And do you have any advice to somebody who's trying to navigate like the real impetus for why they embarked on an endeavor?
That's a good question. Um, I always say the most important skill I learned was being honest with myself. Because if you're honest with yourself, you can overcome any personal struggle you're going through. Like a lot of the worst struggles I went through in my life was because I went a long period of time without being honest with myself about the situation I was in and what I was doing. And when it became too much to bear, I finally, when I had no other choice, would sit down and be really honest with myself. Why am I so hurt by this? Why am I going through this? What could I have done? Instead of just blaming it on the other person or the situation or the scenario, you really got to forget everything else. Even when you feel like you couldn't have done anything better, you really got to peel those layers back and find something you could have done. I think it's a skill in itself, being honest with yourself. It's just like be vulnerable with yourself. You know what I mean? Like just don't be afraid to be vulnerable with yourself and call yourself on your bullshit. Like before anyone else does. Like get good at doing it before anyone else does.
That part is key. Yeah.
So but that leads to, and I went through a period of like, okay, I can be really honest with myself, but now I'm really hard on myself because I can honestly see all of my flaws and where I mess up. I'm constantly being honest with myself. So that it comes back to intentions. It's easier to forgive yourself when you know you had pure intentions. So.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense when it comes to like, it's easier not just only to forgive yourself, but to really do anything with yourself. Like to really have any sort of relationship with your inner self when you can actually be truthful about who that inner self is. I think that's 100%, accurate. And I like how you frame it like that, like it's easier to forgive yourself when you're like being real with yourself. In terms of the things that you're juggling right now, has there been a moment recently or like, in the past that you're like, I really need to forgive myself, like in any of the endeavors I'm pursuing?
I go through this pretty much weekly or bi-weekly at work.
Oh, well, yeah.
I'm QA at Riot. We work on the social and player dynamics team. I'm the quality owner, which means anytime a bug escapes to like the live service where players can see it, I'm constantly beating myself up about it. I'm asking myself honest questions. Did you cut any corners? Are there things you could have done better? Where are the gaps in the process? Like, I go through that so regularly, and that's just work. That's not even in my personal life yet, just work. I deal with this. I think being in QA, I have a unique advantage because like the feedback loop is kind of instant. Like if I'm not doing my job, it becomes very apparent very soon. The patch goes out, things are broken, what the hell happened? The feedback loop is instant, right? So it's easier, I guess, to like, it's easier to face the challenge of like beating yourself up when you get instant feedback, negative feedback on what you're doing, right? But at the same time, it's easier to build resilience to that when you're getting that quick feedback loop, I think is my point, right? I mean, in my personal life, it's like things as simple as like, I'm trying to go to the gym 6 days a week, right? This week I went 4. It's like, I'm beating myself up, but at the end of the day, my whole reason, I have to remember my reason for choosing 6 days is because I know I'm not always gonna hit 6 days. So if I choose 3 days, I might not always hit 3 days. So I know if I aim for 6 days, on a great week, I went to the gym 6 days. On a not so great week, I went 4 days. You know what I'm saying? It's like, if you aim higher and you fail, it's easier to forgive yourself for failing because the failure is still like success for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I understand. Like, aim for perfection, accept excellence. Like that completely checks out. I love your relationship with failure. I just want to like call that out. Like, you know, you're constantly balancing like, hey, what can you take from failure? Also the self-love aspect of like how you can forgive yourself.
It's important.
For individuals who don't have that resilience, who may not even have that feedback loop, and then they have that big failure, like what advice would you have for them to recover? Because what I'm hearing from you is you're getting like a lot of jabs, maybe an uppercut, you know, but you have those failures at such a rapid cadence that your skin has thickened up.
Right,
And
I'm
I think what
calloused.
can happen, exactly, I think callous. I think what can happen in life is in any area, you might get a big hit to an area that you haven't been building those calluses up, you know, emotionally, like, you know, mentally.
Yeah.
So is there a point in your life where you've been hit by surprise by something that you thought was stable but wasn't, and how did you bounce back?
Yeah. You know, my first job in tech, I got a QA job, part-time QA tester, $20 an hour. This was 8 years ago, which $20 an hour for like I was going from like $9 an hour to that. Even though it was part-time, it still worked out, right? I worked that job for 3 years. After my first year, they fired the guy that trained me, and I was the only QA guy at the company for pretty much the rest of my time there. But when I left, it was abruptly. A new CTO came in, and we didn't vibe that well. He didn't really like my way of doing things. He maybe felt I was too junior to be the only QA guy there. And it would really like bust my balls and stuff. And one day we had a situation where a bug had escaped, and I knew why it escaped, and it wasn't really my fault, and I was trying to communicate that, but I guess the way I communicated, because I knew I was right, I communicated a little harsher less tactfully than maybe I should have. And he was like, you know what, I'm done with you. That same day, I lost that job. And I thought I was doing so well, like to the point where I even got that confident to where I thought I could talk to the CTO that well, right? And that was a big failure for me because, like, you know, I was living on my own. I had no other source of income, nobody I could really reach out to help me pay my rent or anything like that. I was in a bad situation. And I felt like such a failure because if I had only, you know, you go through that, if I'd only done this, if I'd only done that, things would be different. And I really beat myself up for a while. But the advice I could give to people going through a situation like that is, in this world, it's easy to feel like your biggest mistake defines you because that's kind of like what the world has become. It can be hard, but don't let it define you. Even if the whole world tells you you're a piece of shit, and by the world's standards, you're a piece of shit, you've got to tell yourself, I'm not a piece of shit. I made a mistake. This is a low low, but the highs will be higher. You know what I mean? And really, that's kind of the best advice I could give is don't let it define you and just find it in yourself to push through it. Because at the end of the day, how I got through that situation, and this might help people, I was like, yeah, my job, my quality of life, all that was taken away from me. But the one thing they can't take away from me is the work experience I gathered over the last 3 years.
Wow.
And I'm gonna use that to get an even better job, which I did. And I was forced to come to that conclusion through the struggle. Like it was like I was going through the struggle. It's up to you how you do it. A lot of people would have let that beat them down and went through weeks of depression and acting like it's the end of the world. The next day, I remember the very next day, I had a choice. I was like, I've got this big TV, this PlayStation. I could sit here and play games and not think about it and just find peace through this, or I can get on my grind, update my resume, and go find another job. And that same day, I got an interview for another job that I ended up getting.
Wow.
Now, everyone goes through struggle, but it's about what you do with it that kind of determines how you're gonna be at the end of that tunnel. You know what I mean? What end of that tunnel you're coming out of. And I could have easily just chose to just play video games that day and let myself like kind of like, you know, put a Band-Aid on it and feel great that day. But I'm the type of person, I can't watch TV, I can't play a video game if I don't know when my next check is coming. And I don't know if that's from just growing up in the struggle. I gotta have a next check. And if I ain't got one, everything stops until I figure that out. And that struggle kind of built me that way. And I ended up getting a higher paying job. Everything about the new situation was better than the last. And it was because I recognized, yeah, I'm on my ass, I look stupid, I messed up, everyone's probably gonna be laughing at me, or I'm embarrassed. But I was like, that work experience, they can't take that away from me. So always lean on the things that people can't take away from you. Even in a bad situation like that, there are things that you've earned that can't be taken.
No, that's so powerful. Being able to figure out, what you're actually in control of, because you can't control the outside elements, even though that you were working hard and you were doing such a great job. You can't control sometimes how the work politics can impact you. You can't control the marketplace. We know that as game developers, like sometimes you're working on one project and then the audience will move to a completely different genre. Yeah. So I think that's like super, super key to take in and figure out, hey, like, how did I level up through this?
Right.
And I think sometimes when we're going through that pain, we may have our perspective just focus on the hurt and not necessarily being able to see the silver lining. What happened in your life growing up that allows you to be able to see the silver lining in those particular moments?
My childhood is like a little hard to explain because it's pretty unconventional. I was born in New York, on Long Island, New York, Central Islip. Not quite like Brooklyn type hood. It was a different type of hood out there. There's a lot of crackheads and gangs. The blood gang culture was huge in New York around that time. I mean, you couldn't even walk 4 blocks without running into a group of gang members. You know what I'm saying? Actually, where I live, you could see my school from the kitchen window because I lived at the end of a dead end, and my school was at the other end of the dead end of the street. And it was like maybe 5 blocks down. I would walk to school, and I remember being afraid to walk to school because all the gang members and stuff. And I just, I watch movies I probably shouldn't have been watching that young, like Above the Rim and movies like this where it just makes the world look like a scary place. So when you see that in the movie and then you see it outside, you're thinking it's as real as the movie, right? I grew up in a 2-parent household, thankfully. My mom and my stepdad, who's basically dad, he's been with my mother since I was in her stomach. My real dad left like before I was born. And it was unconventional because my mom was the breadwinner and she worked hard, and my dad was a felon and couldn't really get stable work. So, he's in the streets kind of, and he was a stay-at-home dad though when he was like not out. He was home a lot, probably a lot more than my mom. I'll be real. My dad was the type to literally put the apron on and cook for us and also discipline us and make sure like we were, straight and narrow. So that in itself is unconventional. Like I was closer to my dad, even though he's my stepdad, than my mom, because he was always home. He was helping me in my homework. He's reinforcing like the discipline. My mom is tired. She gets home working 10 to 12 hours. She's just sleeping. You know what I mean? We didn't really interact with her too much, right? And I don't know, but when I was 13, when I was 12, I moved to Florida with my grandmother and my older brother. And I've got a couple of other younger siblings, and we can get into that too. But I want to bring the point home real quick. Ever since I was 12 years old, I was away from my nuclear family, the immediate family. I was with my grandmother and my brother, and we can get into the whys of that too. And I think since then, there was this feeling of being on my own. You know what I'm saying? It's like I'm away from home, and even though I don't got my parents, they still instilled the foundation with me. So I wasn't like wilding out because my parents weren't there. And my grandma, grandparents tend to be a bit softer. You know what I mean? So I could have gotten away with a lot more. So I just had this feeling of on my own, and I had to find my own way. And I had a lot of bad influences. And, that might sound like a bad thing, but I think it's better to have bad influences than good influences, because good influences, you don't always listen to the advice and follow the example they set. But with a bad influence, you know exactly what not to do. That's how I took it. Like, I had so many bad influences, I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be 40 and still be trying to get a car and still be trying to get I'm not going to be doing that. You know what I'm saying? Just like, in Florida, when I moved to Florida, I moved to Orlando, Florida when I was 12, and I grew up there through my important years. And I grew up around extended family. So these are like distant cousins, uncles, like grand aunts, all that, whatever, right? So I guess that feeling of being on my own, I had to like figure things out. Like I always say, I grew up on the internet because when I was 12 years old and onward, I was just on the internet, and I kind of learned a lot through that, really. Just seeing how people talked about things and ideas, and reading message boards and forums, and just all the information of just different ideas and stuff. And maybe I came across some posts that like opened my mind to just like, I don't know. But I think just growing up on the internet, I kind of learned, and that coupled with like bad influences and knowing what I didn't want to do and what I didn't want to be. And my older brother, we always had this rivalry where I never agreed with how he handled things or did things. So like where he zigged, I always zagged, almost off principle. You know what I mean? And it ended up just making me think different. Because my brother just had, his way of thinking. He grew up, he was older in New York, so he was kind of around like the streets a little bit more than I was when we moved to Florida. So like, it's just like, I don't know, just being maybe a contrarian to my brother, I kind of just picked up maybe I was lucky, I don't know. I can't give like a succinct answer on why I think the way I think, but I think it's a combination of all that stuff.
Yeah, it seems like you had a lot of opportunities to witness people responding to their environment versus reacting to it.
Facts.
And you're able to kind of see like whether this pays off or whether this doesn't. And what you talked about earlier is like, you were let go from that company, and you could have reacted to that. You could have reacted to that by just like, resting, playing games all day. But instead, you dug deep and figured out, hey, what do you want out of the situation? And
really
responded, So like, I guess talk about like that process of like, because you were in New York, you were in Florida, you've been at companies where you're killing it now, you've been at places where things were like were a little bit more rocky. Yeah. What's your process to like help yourself respond versus react? Because that's a trap I think a lot of us get caught up in, especially when like our livelihood's on the line or, we're triggered emotionally.
I think for me, I use kind of a cheat code. Everyone knows this, it sounds a little cliche, but you can only control yourself and how you respond and react to things, right? A lot of times when I'm in a situation like that situation where I had lost my job, I was thinking, as I was sitting down picking up my Xbox controller to play games, I was like, the average person would probably do this. I want to be greater than the average. It's this constant need of wanting to be, not even just other people, just the best version of myself. So I'm constantly, whenever I'm hit with like a situation that I'm like, okay, I can go multiple routes with this. What's the best version of myself gonna do? What would that be? Or I'll look at, what would the average person do here? The average person would probably feel bad for themselves, post on social media, get a bunch of sympathy, get support from their support system, and be enveloped in all of that support instead of getting on their grind and doing what they need to do. So like that's probably the exact thought I had in that moment. I was like, no, I want to be better than that. Like I'm not trying to just, because like at the end of the day, like when you're about to react to something, you got to ask yourself like, what good is this going to do for me? Getting upset or beating myself up, or like what's actually going to drive me results, the results I want. And that's updating my resume, getting on my computer, and not playing games until I've applied to this many jobs. So when I'm doing that, I can feel better knowing I did what I had to do first, and now I could just, take a little break and, like, I don't know, decompress, right? So I think what people need to do in situations like that is think about what you can control and the outcome you want. What's the best outcome? Don't even think about what's too far-fetched. No, think about what outcome you want and find the action that's going to bring you that outcome. And if you can't think of that, then think about what the average person would do, and it's probably the wrong answer, so don't do that. So.
No, I think like you touched on a lot of things. It's like whatever you do, make sure that this is leading towards the results. So even if you do reach out to other people, or if you do like make a post like that, you need to be able, the difference between a reaction and a response is that being able to say like this action will lead to this result. Whereas when it's more just about the action and you're not sure about the result, that can sometimes be a reaction if you do that just in the particular moment. Mm-hmm. When you think about like the things, all these principles that you've come through, like being able to like respond versus react, being able to have a growth mindset and wanting to see like the best version of yourself, what would you say to someone who's aspiring to break into tech? Like, what tools do they need to go from surviving into tech to thriving in tech?
I would say get good at finding information and sorting through information. Except don't discriminate information. Like, just a quick example. One thing I used to do, there's this book called The 48 Laws of Power. When that was first introduced to me by my older brother, I hated it. I hated the idea. I hated that everyone lives by these rules that seem to self-serve them and at others' expenses and stuff, and I rejected the book, didn't even want to read it. As I got older, I realized it's better to be armed with that information and not use it than to just not know about it and be at the receiving end of these laws being applied to you, right? So that's what I mean by don't reject information, accept it all. Like, don't be afraid to Google entry-level positions in what you want to do and looking at the list and Google each item on that list. That's how I got into QA. I was like, I want to make games. How do I make games? I don't want to be a games tester. They don't get treated well and they don't get paid well. Okay, maybe I'll start with software because making games is making software. How do I get into IT, software development? Number 7 on the list was QA. What's QA? Oh, that's like testing. Oh, I tested games all these years as a hobby. This sounds like something I can do. I made a resume that had like shit on it for like tech, but I listed all the games I tested. And I just applied at a bunch of different places, and that's how I got my first part-time job. So it's like get good at finding information. Don't discriminate on the information. It doesn't mean you have to apply every piece of information. Get good at sorting through it and finding the value, and just do your research and really look inward and figure out what you really want to do. And don't be afraid that, oh, what I want to do is be a creative director, but I can never do that because there's all these other steps. Start looking into what creative directors do and start on the level you're on. You know what I mean? Creative direct your own little project. You know what I mean? It's just, get good at information and be really honest with yourself about like what you want to do, and don't be afraid to really just start on the level you're on.
Wow, that's excellent advice. You know, on that note, we're about to close. James, thank you so much for just dropping all of this great knowledge to everyone who's listening. Is there anything that you want to shout out or talk about before we head out?
One thing, shameless plug. One of the businesses I run is called Nintech. We specialize in cell phone accessories. It's an Amazon store. If you search on Amazon, Nintech battery packs. If you're looking for a travel battery pack, check us out on Amazon. It's my first product. I'm looking to launch more. It's very useful for travel. It's a small battery pack. It sticks on pretty much any phone that has wireless charging. It doesn't even have to be a magnetic phone. So again, that's Nintech, N-I-N-T-E-K. Check us out on Amazon.
Awesome, yeah. Man who wears many hats and dropping gems. Thank you so much for coming through.
Yeah, pleasure.
Hello World Fam, thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe if you want to hear more content and more perspectives from diverse and inclusive professionals in the tech and entertainment space. Please follow us at Hello World Mixer on Twitter and IG and other social media.